Want to mention that we, Carolina Public Press, we're based in Asheville, North Carolina. We're a 10-year-old organization celebrating our 10th anniversary this year. We're an independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan news organization dedicated to investigative and in-depth journalism, news coverage that looks at public policy issues that affect all people in North Carolina. And we're so happy to have you with us for this event. This is part of our series called 10 for North Carolina. It's a conversation series that we're having this year as we celebrate our 10 years, and it's part of that celebration. We ask that everyone, as you're joining us, will please stay muted with the exception of panelists, and please have your video off if you're not on the panel. You can participate through chat. Our staff is watching for questions that come in through chat, and they will be filtering them through it to us as we get further on in the discussion. We'll try to get to some of those questions from the group. I want to introduce our panel. Included, we have Ryan Bethea, who gave up teaching to become one of North Carolina's oyster farmers. Ryan uses science to raise award-winning oysters on Harkers Island, which is a 5-acre estuary he leases from the state. He wanted to make a difference in providing fresh and local seafood. Liddy Cunningham leads the Pew Charitable Trust work in U.S. Atlantic waters to protect and restore ocean resources and coastal habitats, including seagrass and oysters, and to ensure sustainable fishing policies. She's based in Morehead City, North Carolina. Jack Eigelman is a reporter with a master's degree from Montana State University, where he studied natural resources economics. He also teaches at Blue Ridge Community College, and he is based in Asheville, North Carolina. His main interest is conservation and environmental stories that affect the people, places, and institutions that are involved in managing the state's natural resources. I want to welcome Sarah Mobilio. Sarah is a fisheries extension specialist at North Carolina Sea Grant. Her work includes cooperative research, and she provides technical training to North Carolina's commercial, for hire, and recreational fishermen. Welcoming Malin Pinsky. Malin Pinsky is an associate professor at Rutgers University in New Jersey. He's in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Natural Resources, and is a member of the Institute of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, an affiliate of the Department of Marine and Coastal Sciences. And welcoming Queen Quet. Queen Quet is chiefess and head of state for the Gullah Geechee Nation. She's a published author, computer scientist, lecturer, preservationist, and environmental justice advocate. She's founder of the premier advocacy organization for the continuation of the Gullah Geechee culture, the Gullah Geechee Sea Island Coalition. And of course, that Gullah Geechee organization is based in South Carolina, but includes part of North Carolina's coastal region as well. So welcoming all of the panelists. And we want to begin with some questions as we think about it, and as a few more people may be joining us. A question, I think this is especially for Ryan, but anybody else who would care to talk about this too. Interested in particularly what's happening with projections for impacts on aquaculture as we think about changes in the environment, in the ecology of the coastal region. And I know that you have a close association with shellfish. Can you talk to us a little bit about what we're seeing in that area?
Yeah. Hey, thanks for having me, everybody. Nice to, thanks for joining the call. We're kind of battling a couple different fronts, and then I think it's important to know that this is what I'm going to talk about is just for me and just something we deal with in North Carolina. There's people on the West Coast dealing with pesticides, a lot of pesticide issues, and then people in the Northeast dealing with ocean acidification. So this is just us. But we're dealing with a lot of sea level rise, and then we're dealing with warmings of the ocean. And the issues, the reason that the ocean warming is an issue is not because the shellfish can't handle higher fluctuation in temperature. It's just because these warmer waters bring wetter storms and more storms. And so not only are we going to get like infrastructure damage from wind and things like that, but we're also going to be, they're closing people's shellfish areas. So the way it works with the state is they use an algorithm to close an area based on how much rainfall happens there, because rainfall equals runoff, right? So, the more impervious surfaces we have, the more runoff we're going to have. And then the more our oceans warm also means that we're going to have more storms, and again, wetter storms. So we've got people in historic oyster grounds like Stump Sound and the Newport River that have been closed in 2018. Some of them closed for 200 days. So you can imagine trying to run a business when you're closed 2 out of every 3 days. So, you know, in terms of economically, that's some of the water stuff we're dealing with, but also water quality is like a no-brainer, right? For all of us. It's weird. I get on these calls and then we talk about like business, we talk about oysters. We all need water quality. It's really like super simple. So, you know, that's kind of the hard stop right there.
Jack, I wonder if you'd like to talk for a second about some of what you saw in the reporting that we did last week about water quality specifically. We're going to get into some of these broader issues as well, but obviously that was a concern that came up.
Yeah, you know, most everyone that I interviewed for this reporting mentioned water quality as an issue, whether it's, you know, people who live in communities or whether it's fishermen who have a concern. Obviously, some of the scientists that are specifically looking at water quality concerns, such as in the Pamlico and Albemarle Sound. So it's definitely a huge issue. And I kind of agree with Ryan. I think he nailed it. It's like the one thing that sort of links this conversation. And I also think it's, you know, I think a learning for me, I don't know, maybe I knew this already, but it's super complicated because the water quality is, sometimes we're not quite sure where it's coming from. There are obviously many sources, period. And I think that makes the policy conversation really difficult because, you know, it's coming from potentially upstream, or there's lots of development going on along the coast, which is obviously having an issue. Some of the, you know, as we think about policy and regulating, some of it's going to come from the state level. Some of it's going to come from the municipal level, and not every municipality or every county might have the same incentive to correct the issues. So I think it's a really complicated one, and more rain, bigger rain, climate changes having an impact on water quality through a variety of different sources. So I think it's a fascinating topic to continue to explore as a reporter, for sure.
Absolutely. I'm interested, some of you who are on the scientific side of this, what are some of the things you're seeing with water quality as they relate to, you know, particularly the access to healthy fish as a food source, as well as the health of the fish themselves?
Well, Frank, this is Queen Quit. I wanted to jump in on that one.
Definitely, please do.
Yeah, because it ties to what the two previous speakers mentioned, but what no one's mentioned so far are the subsistence fishers. So usually when people come to the Carolina coast, I know in North Carolina, the people are cracking teeth too much like this year no more and things like that. But gullah geechees do exist up there in North Carolina, just like they exist down in South Carolina. And so a lot of times we think of that border between us as a stopping point. We all know water finds its own level. The water doesn't know these borders and these boundaries that human beings have decided upon. So whatever is done in North Carolina, we have to consider in South Carolina. Whatever is done in South Carolina, we need to be thinking about North Carolina, and so on. So with the Gullah Geechee Nation going from Jacksonville, North Carolina to Jacksonville, Florida, when we start talking about water quality, when we start talking about the impact on our fisheries, in particular, the oyster beds that we talked about that tied to both our diet and our water quality, this is a critical issue for subsistence fishing families that are native to the coast. And so when we start talking about the overbuilding, and the policies, it's been a critical piece in terms of talking to states about 30 by 30 planning now and setting policies in place that want to protect coastal areas from overbuilding. Now, what I've seen in North Carolina, in particular in Cape Fear, is the interest has come after the Superfund sites have been already determined, that there are already pollutants in the water because of factories that once existed and tied to the economy. And then the shift now needs to be toward a more green and more healthy and sustainable economy. But where do we get the balance, as was just laid out, when you have to deal with local municipalities, the state government, federal government, and then those of us on the international level who've been talking about the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And even this week, we're working on those right now in a major global meeting, and then getting people to really realize how important it is not to continue to build into the shorelines, so that the things that come off the rooftops, that come out of the buildings and the various things that we use, don't immediately end up in these waterways, because we are then going to have a food security challenge. We already have it somewhat. So we have to shift the policy and the economy in the direction that is all about sustainability, including cultural heritage sustainability. And we've worked at the Gullah Geechee Sustainability Think Tank with a number of scientific groups, people who are in universities, starting to look at a lot of these issues south of most of you. But we would like to also look at what's happening in North Carolina and see how we can get models that we can use up and down the coast so that we all can be sustainable together. So I'm so happy I have somebody else here on here with Pew, because our Southeast Atlantic Salt Marsh Initiative is going to take in these same types of things and deal with all of those parameters, including the science of it all and how the marsh and natural buffers and the ocean based Climate Solutions Act, all these things can come into play to help us sustain the water quality, sustain the fisheries, sustain the human health, and of course, sustain the overall environment of our coast.
Very good. And that reminds me of something that came up in the reporting that Jack was doing as we talk about subsistence fishing. We saw concerns, certainly a lot of that reporting focused on northeastern North Carolina. We looked a lot at Tyrrell County where we had an issue. But I'd love to hear from a couple of you who are on the scientific side about how those things are affecting communities on the coast, particularly people who rely on fish to, again, to subsist and to live. Lita, I know you've worked some with Queen or with Pew, as Queen does as well. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing on these issues?
I can, although I was hoping Malin would jump in as the scientist here. Malin, did you want to
go ahead?
I'm happy to jump in if that'd be useful. Yeah, I just wanted to amplify some of the things that have already been said, but also, just by pointing out that these impacts on aquaculture and subsistence fisheries and fisheries more broadly really, we're seeing the impacts in North Carolina, but we're also seeing them throughout the US and really globally. Marine species are very sensitive to even quite small changes in temperature. And then there's also the challenge of ocean acidification, which is another water quality issue that maybe hasn't come up so much, at least in our conversation here. But especially on the West Coast, that's been a big issue for aquaculture, with baby oysters in particular dying off with ocean acidification. And there are concerns that will probably happen or start to be noticed on the East Coast as well. It may already be happening, in fact. So when it comes to fisheries, I mean, the Northeast North Carolina has had some pretty dramatic impacts, warming ocean waters. The summer flounder fishery comes to mind for me, where Beaufort, North Carolina, and many of the ports around there historically have been very large summer flounder fishing communities. They, back in the 1980s, North Carolina was the state that caught the most summer flounder of any state on the East Coast. And yet now, as waters have warmed, warmer water also holds less oxygen. So summer flounder have contracted farther north. So the boats actually out of Beaufort, North Carolina, many of them are now traveling 300 miles further north to go up to New Jersey before bringing their catch back down to North Carolina. So really dramatic changes in fishing communities. And really that means that it's only the large fishing boats that can participate. A lot of the smaller boats just can't go after summer flounder anymore because they can't travel that far.
Would any of the rest of you like to jump in on this issue in particular before we talk about some other aspects?
Yeah, this is Lita. Hi. I'd also flag that I appreciate the promotion you gave me for being in charge of fish all over the US. I'm actually just in charge for North Carolina at Pew.
Okay.
I wanted to bring in habitat because habitat is critical, as we know, for fish and also human habitat. And it is both affected by and then can affect water quality, right? So things that we do that are good for our coastal habitats, such as oysters, coastal wetlands and salt marsh and seagrass, things that we do that are good to protect and restore those habitats also are good for water quality. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about the policy. A couple of people mentioned policy, and I think in some cases, people hear policy as rules and laws and things you have to do that you don't want to do. And in many cases, there are rules and regulations, and those are important. There are also voluntary actions that many people can take that that state agencies can work on with communities. I really appreciate what Queen Quet was talking about. Sounded like a lot of collaboration there. North Carolina is a really special place. We have amazing habitat. We have the second largest estuary anywhere in the country. But we also have this really awesome ecosystem of collaborative groups and people and agencies. And in terms of policy, right now, actually yesterday, the state Department of Environmental Quality just kicked off a 30-day public comment period on the state's coastal habitat protection plan. It is for fish, but it's also for so much else that uses the habitat out there, again, humans as well. And a big focus of the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan, or the CHIP, as people know it, is water quality improvements. So it turns out if you do things, nature-based solutions of, increasing buffers and protecting wetlands and protecting our seagrass, those things are also really good for water quality. So I just wanted to add that in there as part of the conversation, especially with some of the urgent, threats of climate change that we're talking about.
Absolutely, absolutely. We've alluded several times to regulation. I know a question we got from somebody ahead of the event raised an issue that I wanted to see if several of you would like to address. Sometimes there are tensions between the recreational fishing community, which has certain aims, and that includes, we see recreational, people think of people on party boats and things, but we're also talking about people who do subsistence fishing, people who really rely on fishing to eat. And then also the commercial fishing industry, and there are people who rely on fishing as their livelihood. Sometimes those groups, they seem like they have common interests, but they might be at odds on what they think the regulatory situation ought to be and how they ought to be addressed. I wonder if anybody would like to just address, the dialogue that exists or doesn't exist between those and the different aims of the groups to help us to understand what's happening and what activism is happening regarding the regulation and the environment from each of those sides.
Well, I could jump in as a founding member of the Gullah Geechee Fishing Association and say that even what you just stated is not the way Gullah Geechee see it. Subsistence is its own category as far as we see it. And recreation is those who go out into the water more or less to have fun and just enjoy that day, but their lives don't depend on having to eat and live here on the coast. And then you have the commercial folks who, like you said, their livelihood is attached to what they're doing. So we have been fighting for 10 years to make sure that each one of the states from North Carolina down to Florida actually has Gullah Geechee subsistence rights laws in place, like they do in Alaska, like they do for other indigenous groups, because what has happened is because most Gullah Geechees look like me. So there has evolved this chasm, not only between the commercial fishers, but also between the DNR and our fishing families, because most of the fishermen that we've talked to, many of them gave up going out there fishing because they felt targeted, like there was fishing while black. No one was dealing with what their issues are if they had one fish that was a little bit too long, or they had a half a bucket more clams than maybe the regulation suddenly had switched to, and they didn't realize it. And they've had boats confiscated. They've had the catch confiscated. They've had their implements confiscated. So this has been an issue we've been battling for a long time, where people say, oh, you're right, because this has been your tradition, which predates these laws, these policies, these things that are in place. It's true. You all should be able to still subsist because you literally depend on seafood as part of staples of our diet. That's different than if we just decided to get on a boat, go out there, with cast nets or, the rod and reel and hang out with friends. It's a way different atmosphere. So for us, we have fallen in between the cracks in terms of those two that you mentioned. And so the battle usually becomes when people say someone's overfishing. Well, someone going out with a rod and reel can't overfish. I mean, they can't bottom out the creek, as we would say, or go derby fishing. But someone with a trawler brings up everything, things they don't even want to bring up, get brought up. And so now it becomes, where is the place where we can sit and work together? And many times we're left out of the discussions entirely. So nobody really looks at the issue of those who've been here for hundreds upon hundreds of years, from the 15 and 1600s to now, and what we were doing that still actually mitigated harm to the environment and still sustained the communities. And so that's where a lot of times where we could have commonality, because we all love the water, we all love the fisheries, we love being out there. Where the break comes is when the money comes in and when the policy comes in, and who's getting fined and who's not, and who's getting blamed and who's not really doing it. That becomes a big, big issue. Fortunately, in the Gullah Geechee community, we don't really separate out our folks, whether they work in the commercial industry or they just do subsistence like that. And we have easy dialogues, and we've gone to fishermen's exchanges even as far away as Texas. And when you can get folks together away from the dock, sometimes on the boat too, we went fishing, to really talk about what we do have in common, we can start to put things in place that support all of us in that industry, and even teach each other some best practices that somebody just coming in for the day wouldn't know from somebody else that's been here, and our ancestors were here before us for hundreds of years. And so it's very important that we are talking about that today, because it's a critical discussion that's been going on at state levels, and we need to move it forward.
And I'm getting a warning that because we had to switch to a different version of Zoom, we may have to log back off and log back in. So just be aware of that. We'll cross that bridge if we get there. Is that imminent, guys, or are we? Should I have everybody log off and log back in now, or do we wait a couple minutes? Do we have time for one more question?
I think go ahead with one more question. I've dropped the link in the chat for everyone who's currently on. So why don't we do one more question, and then we can just log back in and extend the time. We have plenty of time. We have a half hour left. So
okay. Yeah, so following up on what Quinquette has just shared, I just wonder about other perspectives about that relationship between recreational and commercial fishermen. Are we seeing that type of distinction elsewhere? What are we seeing elsewhere, and how is that playing out in the different viewpoints that might be out there?
Frank, I might add to that. As someone who's up in the mountains who might not necessarily have an economic interest in fishing, or have very few opportunities to actually go fishing since the coast is a long way away, I definitely wanted to write these stories with the perspective that it's a statewide issue, and that people in Asheville or Murphy or Charlotte or Greensboro also have a stake in this. Many of us are recreational fishermen. That is, we enjoy going to the pier to see what we catch, or to hire a charter boat if we have those resources. Perhaps many people actually own a boat and pull it on down. But I also rely on commercial fishermen. In fact, I just bought a couple pounds of shrimp from the farmer's market yesterday. That was, it said it was wild caught, North Carolina. I believe it was. It tasted good, but I think we all have a stake in it, in both the recreational and commercial side as well as what Ryan is doing from an aquaculture commercial. He's not a fisherman, but obviously growing fish so it's really a statewide issue that we all have a stake in. And I think it does get a little problematic when we divide it up. I'm probably guilty of that in the way that I write stories, but I think there are some interesting dynamics that are worth exploring.
Okay. All right. Just a quick question, really to anybody, as we worry about these issues like water quality, like rising seas, like habitat damage, what are some of the things we can really see being happen to kind of ameliorate and to stabilize? What kind of resilience options are there for us out there?
I can start off, but I imagine many other panelists have things to add as well. You know, there's sort of two main categories of things. One on the climate adaptation side. You know, we've already heard discussion of marsh restoration to help absorb some of the storm surge and the impacts from larger storms. You know, Ryan was also talking about runoff and ways to help, you know, by reducing impervious cover and basically parking lots. That really helps, again, reduce those water quality issues as they come into the water. There's also, you know, a lot we can do on the fisheries side. You know, they're sort of making sure that the fish populations are abundant, will help them be most resilient and most likely to survive these rapid environmental changes that they're experiencing. You know, as water is warm, fish can't escape. They're really stuck. They're ectotherms, they're cold-blooded, they can't escape those warming temperatures. They don't have an air conditioner. And so making sure that our fishing communities have ways that they can adapt to the new species that are becoming more abundant. You know, in North Carolina, species like pink shrimp tend to be more abundant in warm years. But other species like summer flounder, as I talked about earlier, are becoming less abundant. So these transitions in our coastal fishing communities, we don't necessarily have the rules and the regulations always to allow that flexibility. But the tricky part is we need to allow, you know, we're talking about that kind of flexibility without allowing overfishing, because if we allow too much fishing, these populations will be that much more sensitive to changing ocean conditions. I see we've got a minute left, Frank. I just wonder if...
Yeah, why don't we go ahead and take the break and log back in if that works for everybody else. We've talked quite a bit about water quality issues, and we've alluded to habitat issues.
Sure.
One of the things we also encountered in our reporting was concern about access issues, particularly areas where people live in areas that, due to rising seas, due to changing ecology, and due to frequent storms, they maybe have trouble, people may have trouble getting access to places where they used to go fishing, especially people who rely, as we've talked about, rely on fishing as a thing to eat, not just for fun and not necessarily for their livelihood, but just for their basic being able to eat. So that access issue is there. And we also see the problem of the coast being built up as people are denied direct access to places that were once more publicly accessible. I wonder if some of you would like to talk about that issue of access as an issue that we see both due to climate change and building up on the coast. Jack, I know that's something that did come up in the reporting that you did as well.
Yeah, Lita, you were about to say something. I'll turn it over to you real quick.
Well, I wasn't going to say something about access, but I wanted to go back to the question right before we broke.
Please do.
I think the question was something about, you know, what can we do?
Yeah.
So it's often not as exciting, but good plans help, right? And so I think a lot of us would like to go out there and roll up our sleeves and just do something tomorrow. And when that option is not there, I would encourage anyone who's listening to join a group, sit in on a listening session. There are more and more opportunities to take part in good planning. plans are only as good as the people and ideas that go into them. So I mentioned the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan that's gone out for public input. Ryan is part of an important effort called the North Carolina Oyster Blueprint, which is really cool. I don't know of anybody that has an oyster blueprint, right? We have one of those. There's increasing resilience plans, and spoiler alert, resiliency and coastal habitat protection and addressing fisheries issues related to climate change are all part of the same package. So to the extent that you're on listservs and getting communiques from different NGOs and government organizations, please turn out to those public meetings and really talk about what's important to you. I see Malin's hand is up, so I just wanted to put that out there, like public participation as something we can all do.
Yeah, Lita, I just wanted to follow up. We both of us have talked about the adaptation side, right? We're seeing such dramatic changes along our coasts and in the ocean, and to our coastal communities. But the other part of it that the recent international report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change made so clear is that this next decade is really a key time to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and I think we have to make sure that that is also part of the conversation. I mean, whether it's as individuals thinking about renewable power and electricity for our homes, our buildings, driving less, biking more, thinking about energy efficient towns. This really can start at a local level, but we're at a point where really dramatic changes are happening, and they're likely to get a lot worse as the more we push our ocean and coastal ecosystems. We know these ecological systems have tipping points. We don't really know where they are. And it's hard to know if we're getting close to them and how much farther we can do before we're likely to cross one. So I think it's a really important area to be risk averse and do what we can to avoid pushing them farther.
I want to come back in a minute to the access question I started to raise, but I think this segues nicely to a question I wanted to ask Sarah.
Hey,
Could you talk to us, Sarah, about the educational, the importance of educational programs in trying to make sure the public is better informed on these issues? Did we lose Sarah?
I think Sarah may be logging back in.
Okay.
Hey, Mr. Taylor, I'll talk about it for a second while we're waiting for Sarah.
Yeah,
please do.
That's fine. And I think that we are waiting on Sarah and Queen Quet, who needed the new link. So again, I apologize.
Okay. Please
So
go ahead, Ryan.
the question was about education?
Yes.
Yeah, so as a former educator, I hope it's not lost. Education is super important, and that's not just because I used to teach. But what we find is, like, we have an acre of waterfront property at Harkers Island. We can take kids there. We can take formerly incarcerated folks there. We can take folks that live in the county that want to stay in the county and work, and do commercial fishing or do aquaculture and still contribute to society. All this water quality stuff, climate change, to me, it's all pretty much an education issue anyway. If folks knew what was happening to the planet, we wouldn't have deniers, right? And we wouldn't have, we wouldn't be in this spot anyway. I mean, if we would have listened to the folks that were indigenous to this country when we first started colonizing it, we wouldn't be in this place that we are now in terms of overfishing and, a lot of the other issues we have. So to me, it's kind of like water quality. It all comes back to education, right? All this stuff comes back to water quality, and we wouldn't be in this. We wouldn't even be on this Zoom right now if everybody was educated in kind of what's happening.
Thank you, Ryan. Sarah, are you back with us now? I was asking a question, and Ryan helps us to think about it a little bit too, but I wanted to come to you for a minute.
I'm sorry, I logged in. I don't know the question,
Yeah,
Ryan.
no, I know. So
What
we're
are you
talking
very
about-
eloquent, Ryan, but I didn't hear the question you answered.
yeah, no, we're just talking about the importance of educating the public. And I know you have some involvement in that, in working with the fishing communities and looking at information issues. Can you address the vitality of that?
Educating the public on natural resource issues is the question. What are the challenges, or?
Just the importance of it, but feel free to expand.
I mean, I think the challenge in science right now is getting ahead of misinformation. You know, when you were, gosh, I mean, I've almost been 20 years with Sea Grant. It's hard to believe. 2 decades. And I remember I'd send like 5 emails a day. Now I send about 5 emails in 30 seconds. And so you had more time to proof information. You know, newspapers were mostly print editions that went out, you know, a couple times a week. Some were weeklies, not even dailies. And, you know, you could talk to people, proof articles. There wasn't social media. So it's really hard to understand what's fact from fiction. It's interesting from a sociological standpoint of the sources people trust for information and how that's evolved with time over the years, you know, government versus non-government sources. And, you know, that plays a lot into what information you believe, if you trust an organization or not. And so I think that's the hardest challenge for me is you have all this information that everybody's being bombarded with. It's hard to, you know, fact check it, peer review it. So we try to offer education to folks. Jack took actually one of my online class this past winter, 6 nights, 6 Tuesdays he hung in there while we talked about fisheries stock assessment and did a lot of models, scary modeling. I mean, that's one way you can get ahead of it is you don't put information necessarily on a specific topic. You're just generally educating people on specific terms and general topics, so that then they themselves can read information down the road and make some informed decisions for themselves of what they want to believe or not believe. So, you know, I think it's challenging right now for anybody in the education sector on how to get their information accurately out there. And we're trying to do more peer-reviewed publications, which I don't have a professorship appointment. I'm a non-teaching faculty at NC State University, but I'm trying to do more peer-reviewed publications than I used to, just so that people feel more assurance in that information, because other colleagues like Malin or whatever might read my research results and have validated that that was accurate or not accurate or an approved methodology. That's something I personally am trying to do more of, just so that people will have more trust and faith in the information. I don't think that answered your question, but I don't really have a great question right now. It's something I think most of our organizations that do education outreach are struggling with, is how do you get ahead of the information train with your facts and figures. But
yeah, absolutely. I think that goes to what I was trying to ask. Absolutely. Well, I want to get back to this question that we had started on earlier about access. And Jack, you were going to speak to that, I think, looking at some of what we found in the reporting. And then I'm interested to hear from others who see that as an issue too, that maybe isn't the first thing people think about with climate change, but it's certainly an issue for people who are right on the coastline and experiencing that.
Yeah, Frank, that was definitely a focus of the reporting. There's just a ton more to do on that. Part of the evolution of my reporting just came from spending time at Atlantic Beach over the last couple of decades. It's sort of our family beach that we go to, and over time seeing the piers disappear from the coast. I can't remember. I feel like there were 3 or 4 on Atlantic Beach. Now they're down to 1, and that one is struggling as it gets hit by more and more storms. And what I always loved about the pier is that it's such a the people fishing from the pier are so diverse. There's quite a range of, just from making probably stereotypes, I suppose, but looking at folks and seeing just a cool cross section of people enjoying time up there, and seeing those disappear is obviously a loss of an access point. And, as you pull back and look at other places, Frank, you mentioned Terrell County, which we did some reporting on, which is a very low-lying county on the Albemarle Peninsula, and also a relatively poor county where people do rely on fishing for income or fishing for subsistence, and simply losing roads to more frequent flooding, water quality again. All those sorts of things are making it more difficult. And my sense is that over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, we'll start seeing more access issues come up as sea level rises, or just simply the water quality issues as related to climate change. And the only other thing that might segue to your next question, Frank, that you were talking about is, and what Malin and Sarah were saying, and Leah as well, everyone actually on the panel has been saying it, is that I think the kind of strategies that we adopt are going to need to be highly individualized, because what's going to work in Terrell County won't necessarily work in Morehead City or in Wilmington. Our coast is just really different, and the needs of each community. So climate change adaptation and resilience is going to be just highly individualized, and I think that makes it even more complicated. One size won't fit all. One big state plan won't work.
Queen Quet, I wanted to ask you, I know that both Carolinas have experienced a real impact from severe storms along our coast in recent years, really all the way up the Carolina coasts. And I'm just wondering what you see as far as the impact for access to infrastructure along the coast for people who fish, particularly people who need to fish, and what you're observing there as far as how climate change is having that type of an impact.
Well, climate change has truly had an impact in terms of our food security overall, because as we all know, certain types of seafood, they're seasonal, as well as the fact that a lot of Gullah Geechees are agrarian and we go in the water. So we harvest from both. We harvest from the water and from the land. So when you mention storms, just let's go back just 2 days ago, yesterday, day before that, we didn't have a tropical storm or hurricane. Thank God. I pray we have none this year. Let them keep staying out in the Atlantic, but not touching land, please. Thank you. However, we still had the remnants of it. So we still had all that water that we started off discussing today that ends up causing our oyster beds and things to get closed. We've had that coming in and then damaging the literal infrastructure people live in. So now it becomes a choice between, if I have to get my roof fixed because now I got a leak because of all this water, do I have money now to maybe fix a leak that could have been in my boat? Which one am I going to do? So when we start talking about the overall impacts of storms, there are so many multi-stressors. If you're a farmer like me, you put in your fall crop ahead of the rain because you wanted rain. You didn't want a deluge flood. Well, I actually took pictures today of the water still in the rows and where some of the little sets went under. And so when we're looking at balancing out the food security overall, it now becomes a situation with storm after storm. What can we literally afford to still have? What remains? So what a lot of people end up doing is, if they have access points, and that's been an issue with overbuilding, is people blocking many of the traditional fishing access points. If they have access points, can you go out there still and get some blue crab? Can you go out there with a cast net, get some shrimp? Can you go out there, catch some mullet or something on foot and not have to have the boats and things that are the fishing infrastructure that we need? And for most of us, we don't build docks because that's not part of our tradition. We go out by landings. But with the docks that have proliferated our coast, that has also had a negative impact because we found that the shading caused by docks now creates a situation where what normally would have grown there because it got direct sunlight is not there. And that particular algae and other things that our other creatures in the water would feed on, they don't have it to feed on, they migrate away. So when you have that, you have ocean acidification, you have these storms. Then if a storm is a tropical storm or hurricane and tears apart docks, that debris is in the water. So now what do we do with that? Because the people who want the private dock, they don't want to take responsibility for cleaning it out of the water when it's torn apart. The same thing if you have a multiplicity of these privately owned boats that don't get removed before the storm and they all get dilapidated in the water because of the storm. Nobody then wants to take responsibility for cleaning it out. They said, well, the county should do it. The township should do it. No, you should do it because it was yours before the storm, it's still yours after the storm. And we all have a responsibility as human beings to protecting these waterways. So when we talk about infrastructure, traditionally, we wouldn't have built there. Again, that's not something we would build. The infrastructure would really be the implements for us that we take out and we bring back. We take out and we bring back away from those shorelines. So again, when we talk about traditional knowledge, we talk about listening to those of us who've been indigenous to this area. There's a lot we spoke about for decades. No one would listen. We're praying now that people will, and that policies and positionings of these things that others like to have would be done in ways that are more communal, like our lifestyle. If you're going to have a bunch of boats, have a marina, don't have all these individual docks, and then have responsibility, because it's all about what responsibility are we each going to take going forward. And I just want to add, because I put it in the chat, but when we're talking about educating people, the unfortunate reality is what's been stated. A lot of people aren't going to sit in on our webinars. They're not going to sit in and listen to us do techno speak, as I call it as a scientist. But if we do campaigns that are more exciting, engaging, and do it that goes through social media, then you get more people viewing it. You get more of them talking about it and discussing it. So we have to change the way in which we communicate. If I sat here all day and been a trauma down like this and thing like that, and top of the thing we've been a back on and thing, y'all would have been like, huh, what? Why is she on here? We don't know what she's saying. Well, that's the way the public feels about scientists most of the time. When we're talking about climate change, we're talking about infrastructure, and we're talking about the impacts on it. We have to be able to speak in a way that's accessible to everyone. And we have to have access points for everyone to be able to engage on the coastline and really protect it for the future generations.
I want to touch on something that Queen quite brought up. And I'm wondering, I know this has come up some in Jack's reporting. I'm interested in hearing from some of you also about this. It's not just the access. It's not just the thinking about water quality affecting the sea life, although both of those are huge issues. But another issue has come up is the fish even safe to eat because of human things that have gotten into the water? And I know I worked at one time in Eastern North Carolina, had actually moved out of state for a while, but watched sadly what happened when Hurricane Floyd hit in the late 90s, and we saw severe pollution due to hog lagoons that got into the water table and into the streams. And there was concern certainly inland about water quality, but we know everything flows downstream. We know between agricultural waste like that and industrial waste, the runoff from development. How concerned should people be about eating the seafood that comes from our waters off the Carolina coast? Jack, you may want to start, and I would love to hear from others on this as well.
I think obviously that is a concern to some extent. I think the science is maybe a little complicated on that one. There is, I did do some reporting on concerns with blue crabs, since blue crabs apparently eat everything, including each other, if there's nothing else. And so as the, water quality in sounds declines and there's more nutrients that might be negative, that could potentially be a concern. So, water quality and the ability to consume seafood is obviously an issue, among others.
Do you, the rest of you hear this kind of concern from others, and how important should we make this emphasis about the quality of what's what's coming out of the water?
I mean,
I'm
maybe
not
I'll
hearing-
just make the point that, I mean, obviously it's really important. In general, seafood in the US is quite closely regulated and carefully monitored. Obviously it's an ongoing issue, and attention still needs to be paid to it. And especially, issues that you've brought up with, like contamination in groundwater, these are serious concerns. From a environmental sustainability perspective, in terms of just not taking too many fish out of the water, the US in general actually does quite a good job. We hear we see quite a few headlines about fisheries collapsing around the world, and that definitely is a problem. But in general, seafood from the US tends to be quite a good choice because of the careful regulation that we have. That said, a lot of the seafood that shows up in the supermarket is imported. In terms of what we eat in the US.
Yeah, I think, and Sarah might be able to speak to this too, but a lot of the work that NCC Grant has done is helping develop marketing channels, for a lot of people. There's great demand, or there's a very solid demand for wild caught seafood. Not to diss you, Ryan. I think what you're doing is awesome. I think aquaculture is going to play a huge role in the future, providing food to people. But my experience with the commercial fishermen that I spoke to is they take a lot of pride in what they catch, and some are trying to develop a brand for themselves. And I think that makes a lot of sense. People will want to return to the seafood that's caught by a particular fisherman, because it does matter. One thing that I learned being on a commercial boat briefly is that there's a whole process, and when that fish comes out of water and how it's cared for before it even goes to the fish house, and then how the fish house handles it and how quickly it moves up the supply chain. It's really fascinating. So I think it is, one big plus for trying to encourage the consumption of wild caught local seafood near the coast that you live in. And I think that's promising. I think there's some cool things happening on that front.
I wanted to salute North Carolina too, and nobody can evict me from South Carolina because all this is a Gullah Geechee Nation anyhow. So I wanted to salute North Carolina because it was North Carolina Sea Grant, and it was one of the CC events where I got this little pocket guide, and I wish I had brought it out today to show everyone that was developed years ago that you could just stick in your wallet, that talked about the seafood that was safe to eat. At the time, so many of us were out here doing research about mercury and into so much of the fish. And now people are concerned about PFAS and other things, PFAS and other chemicals and things. So it was great to have that little guide so that a person visiting the area or living in the area could look at it and know what fish was safe to just eat. And so we wanted to replicate that. But again, when we talk about the educational component and we talk about the marketing components and all these things we've been discussing today, it's always about the money, right? And the money to be able to produce it and then get it out there to the public. I definitely wanted to give a salute to North Carolina Sea Grant because they were the ones that led that effort up there. And we're talking about having safe food.
Appreciate that. Ryan, you were mentioned a minute ago on the question about Wildcat versus aquaculture. Did you want to weigh in on that at all?
I wasn't going to unless you were going to ask. So I appreciate you asking. So I think, and sorry if I'm going to go a little long on this, but I think it's important to kind of
we got a late start
to kind of talk on it. So one thing we need to realize is not all farming is the same, right? Free range hogs walking around on a farm, with no hog lagoon, that's not going to affect the same as, a Smithfield plant. So I think we need to think about that, not just interspecies wise, but just generally. NC State does a really good job with the striped bass farming, and it's like such a delicious fish. I say that because we had some people talk about regulation and things like that. If you eat something that's farmed, it's going to be very well regulated. It's going to be ultra safe, and it's going to be delicious, right? I mean, someone's growing it to taste good. So I think that needs to be said. I think I'll say two other things. One, oyster farming is different than regular than other fish farming. People call me all the time asking, they don't understand that our oysters are in the sound. They're in the marsh. They're covered in wild oysters. They're covered in barnacles, things like that. They're diploid oysters. We had some kids from NC State come out to our farm. They went and took 20 oysters off our farms. They took it to the lab, and they came back with 280,000 oysters. That's the most sustainable thing I've ever heard of in my life. We literally took 20 oysters off our farm, made 280. And they were just wild oysters growing on our stuff. So to kill 20, bring back 280,000 is definitely notable, right? So I think that's the second thing I want to say is that oyster farming in particular is barely farming. It's just taking oysters. I mean, we'll get wild oysters from guys that'll tong them up. We'll get those and we'll put them in an oyster bag on our farm and let them purge. And is that a farmed oyster or is that a wild oyster? You know, it's kind of up to the people. And then, yeah, I'll leave it all at that. Oh, well, I mean, it's also important to know too, in our world, I know there's some people on here that are in charge of rec fishing and some commercial fishing guys on this call. We don't have a battle. There's no battle between like oyster farmers and wild oyster guys or fish farm and commercial guys. That's not really a battle. There's so many people eating seafood out there. The more oysters I grow, the more wild oysters there will be out there, which means less regulations for those guys. The more oysters those guys can tong up. You know, if people are eating wild striped bass or people eating farm striped bass, then that means the wild striped bass population is going to increase, right? So then now you can catch more wild striped bass. And, you know, our population in this country and in this world isn't stagnant, right? It's increasing. So we have increased pressures. And, you know, it really works hand in hand. A lot of people think it's a battle, or a lot of people think one's going after the other. Commercial fishermen, they've got a great thing. Aquaculture people, they've got a great thing. The more aquaculture grows, the more fish and oysters and everything else will be left in the ocean for other guys to catch. So it really, they both go up next to each other. And I think that's important to know.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ryan. Well, we're coming up on the deadline on our time, so I'm getting a signal that we need to wrap up pretty soon here. I just want to thank everybody for being involved today, and want to thank everybody for attending this part of our 10 for NC series. And make you aware again, North Carolina Public Press is a nonprofit organization. We rely on donations from people who are interested in the work that we do, and we encourage everyone to consider contributing. And we want to let everybody also know, everybody who was on the panel and who attended will receive recordings of the event too, that you can feel free to share. And I think we'll probably be publicizing that as well later on. Thanks again to everyone, and hope everybody has a good afternoon.
This was great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I did want to mention
thanks
too,
so much.
thank you everyone who participated and on our panel. And this, the series Changing Tides was in part supported by the Pulitzer Center. So thank you, Pulitzer Center.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much, everyone. It's great to see everyone.
Thank you again.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you
Everyone.
all.
Bye, guys.
Blessings.